We wanted to start with some introductions and connections just to get us grounded here. And we're waiting for one more trainer that's just having a computer issue. So hopefully we'll get that resolved shortly here. But I'll kick it off. I'm Katie Haverly. I'm the Acting Executive Director for Everyone Home. I'll kick it over to you, Kristy.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Christy Greenwald. I'm a subcontractor with Apt Associates, and my pronouns are she and her. And I think Dusty is here, so I'll turn it over to Dusty.
Hello. Okay, I appear to be having some major technical difficulties. So I apologize. Hopefully my computer turns on all the way and you can see me in a minute. My name's Dusty Olson. I use she, her pronouns. I am with Apt Associates, and I have been assigned to be a technical assistance provider to Oakland and Alameda County for a little over 2 years now. So I'm happy to get to be in this.
Not good timing for the computer issues. So why don't we go ahead and why don't we have everyone else quick do intros? I think that we were hoping to just get a quick sense of who else was in the room with us. Katie,
Good morning, everyone. I'm Natasha Paddock, Deputy Director over the Homeless Division for Housing and Community Development. And Katie, if you want, I can just kick off a punt. So I'll kick it over to Vivian.
Thanks, Natasha. I'm Vivian. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for Abode Services. And I will pass it to Josh Thurman, if there's more than one.
I know sometimes they get called on. I'm like, which one? I'm not used to having two Joshes in the room. I'm Josh Thurman from the city of Livermore. I'm the Human Services Program Manager. And I'll pass it over to Darren.
Thank you, Josh. This is Darren Lowndes. I'm the Executive Director of Housing Consortium East Bay, Leadership Board member, and member of the Organizational Health Committee. And let's see, I can't see. I will send it off to Dorcas.
Sorry, trying to unmute myself. I'm Dorcas Chang, the Operations Manager at Everyone Home, and I'll pass it on to Tracy. Oh, Tracy, I think you're on mute.
Okay, I'm sorry. I've been having problems with my computer this morning. I'm Tracy Nelspell. I am the Executive Director of A Diamond in the Rough, which is a housing provider for the homeless population in Oakland.
And I'll jump in. I wanted to introduce a new staff member we have at Everyone Home, Nalene de Guzman, who has been working with us as a administrative assistant, and we are so happy to have her on board. So just wanted to welcome her to the group. And Nalene, go for it. Say hi.
Hi, new to the team. Excited to be here.
And then who has not gone? Paul, have you gone?
No, I haven't. Thanks, Katie. Hello, everyone. Paul Berry here with Alameda County Youth Action Board and youth seat on the COC and Leadership Board. And I'll pass it to Carrie. Oh,
Thanks,
go ahead,
Paul.
Simone.
Carrie Abbott with the Office of Homeless Care and Coordination in Healthcare Services Agency. And I don't think Simone has gone.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Simone Falls with the City of Oakland Community Homelessness Services Division. I'll pass it to Susan.
Good morning, Susan Shelton, Everyone Home Leadership Board.
And Lori, have you gone?
No, thank you. Good morning, Lori Flores, Homeless Services Manager for the City of Fremont and also new to the CoC / Leadership Board. And Nick, have you gone yet?
No, Laurie. Hi, everybody. Nick Ming. I serve on the HMIS committee, oversight committee. I don't know who hasn't gone.
I think we've got Kate.
All right.
Hi, I'm Kate Hart. I'm the Director of Programs at SAVE and also the Chair of the System Coordination Committee.
I think Darlene.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Darlene Flynn. I'm the Director of the Department of Race and Equity for the City of Oakland.
And Kimberly, did you also already go?
No, hi, I'm Kimberly White. I'm on the Everyone Home Leadership Board. I'm there as lived experience, and I also now work at a shelter in Livermore as a life skills instructor. Is there anyone else?
Tunisia?
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Tunisia Owens. I'm the Policy and Advocacy Manager at the Family Violence Law Center. I serve on the HUD CoC and HMIS oversight.
And I think we've just got Lisa. If you can hear us, Lisa.
Yeah, hi. Good morning, everyone. Sorry, I'm in transit and had a few technical problems. I'm Lisa Vargus. I'm the Director of Health, Housing, and Community Services with the City of Berkeley, and I'm a member of the Leadership Board.
All right, anyone we missed? Great, thank you so much everyone for making time today so we can be together in this space to talk about the important topics we're going to cover today to help us all get more oriented about our work with the CoC, with our new leadership board, and our folks are also joining us today from our racial equity work group that was just also launched last week. So I want to welcome them here today, and I'm going to turn it over to Dusty and Kristy.
Okay, can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, that's good. I don't believe you're going to be able to see me, unfortunately, because every time I click the start video icon, Zoom completely freezes up. So you are all frozen on my screen. But I'm glad you can at least hear me. I called in on the phone. So I apologize for this. I have no idea what's going on. But it appears to be something once I get into the Zoom meeting that is shutting everything down. So. So let's start with introductions. Katie, is somebody going to be able to share the slide?
Yes, we've got you all queued up here, Dusty.
Okay. Perfect. I can't see. I can just see all your frozen faces. So can you all see the slide?
We can.
Great. Okay. So if you want to go to the welcome and introduction slide, Kristy and I'll start and do a little more introduction of us just quickly, and then we'll go over the agenda. As we both said, we're with Apt Associates. Oakland Alameda County has been assigned to, or Apt Associates has been assigned to Oakland Alameda County for about 4.5 years now altogether. First as your unsheltered TA provider, and then as your what's called S1, which stands for Stimulus 1, which doesn't mean anything other than you were a community designated by HUD as a tier 1 community based on the level of stimulus response, that's what the S stands for, that your community received. So Kristy is actually working with you under your original unsheltered contract, and I am working with you under your stimulus response contract. So between the two of us, we've got like years and years of your technical assistance covered here. Next slide, please. So today we are going to talk about, I'm going to set this up just real quick so that I can see the slides on my end. That's interesting. That didn't work. Okay. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the CoC interim rule, the different CoC functions and the requirements of being a CoC that you are obligated under federal funding to meet. But I think that it's a really important context as we begin to understand that this is a framework that is identified by HUD that is designed not exclusively to meet your funding requirements, but is designed to set you up to be a functioning integrated system so that you can best respond to homelessness regardless of funding source, regardless of the program level. It's really an infrastructure so that you are working together in a way that has been demonstrated to be successful in moving the needle on addressing homelessness. Next slide. And this is really hard that I cannot see what you're seeing. So I think we want to go one more to acronym. So we, homelessness is an incredibly acronym heavy line of work, like most things are. And Kristy and I will both try our very best to not use a bunch of acronyms at all possible, but we wanted to make sure that you had them available to you for your own resources as we both move through the presentation, but also just as you move through your work as a CoC board. So we will try not to use a ton of them as we move through other than CoC, because continuum of care is hard to say over and over and over again. So we will use CoC, but that stands for continuum of care. And there's a lot more that are not on here, but it's really important that as you're onboarding new board members or committee members, right, if they don't have this homelessness background, that you're really working to try to onboard them to the alphabet soup that is the homelessness world, because we all talk in this really specific lingo.
And then Dusty, I just want to acknowledge, I know that we have a mix of folks with us today, folks that have years and years and years of experience and know these programs and requirements and acronyms like the back of your hand. And then we have some folks that are newer. And so just wanted to acknowledge that, we are really trying to create a foundation, especially for folks that are perhaps newer to your leadership board. I am going to be monitoring the chat, so if folks want to, have a specific question at any point, feel free to drop that in, and we'll make sure that we can get to specific questions as well as we're running through this very high-level information. So, Dusty, back to you.
Great. Next slide, please. So we wanted to just provide a little context about the history of CoC regulations. So the McKinney-Vento Act was first established in 1987, which was the first major legislative financial response to homelessness, federal response, not financial. But I think it's important to think about, like, 1987 was not that long ago. So this really is all infrastructure that's really been developed, relatively recently within the work that we've done. And the largest amendment that we work under really is called the Hearth Act. You'll hear that a lot, which stands for Homelessness Emergency Assistance and Rapid Transition to Housing, which was in 2009, which was the last major change that we've had to the McKinney-Vento Act. McKinney-Vento is reauthorized regularly, but there's not been substantial changes in quite some time to the basic underlying foundation. However, in 2012, the CoC program interim rule was established. And that is really the foundation for the regulations for the CoC and what you are required to do, and applies to the funding that you receive as a continuum of care. It's important to note that it is still an interim rule, meaning it has never been completely finalized. And that's really because Once you finalize a federal rule, it's really hard to change it. Like, you've got to get Congress involved and all sorts of things. So if you leave it interim, they can make tweaks and adjustments as things change. But once you finalize it, then it's, you know, it's an act of Congress to make changes. So it's, you'll see a lot of things within homelessness that are kind of left interim for a very long time. The other big one is coordinated entry. It's still an interim role. Next slide, please. So a continuum of care is designed to be a collective of your representatives from all your relevant organizations within a geographic area, right? So that geography for yours is the county. For different COCs, that's different. It sometimes can be a whole state. It can sometimes be just a city within a county. It kind of depends, but it's really geographic specific. It's important to know, though, that relevant organizations doesn't just mean homelessness, right? It does mean homelessness and homeless service providers, but it also may mean victim service providers, faith-based organizations, public housing, other systems that interact and intersect with homelessness, like school districts, mental health, hospitals, affordable housing developers, law enforcement. So there's a lot of potential partners to be involved in your continuum of care. But essentially, the goal of your continuum is to convene all of these representatives and relevant organizations together and plan for your region to carry out and implement the requirements of the interim rule, which are really, like I said, only about creating a framework so that you can have the most successful response to homelessness possible. So ideally, what we're going to talk about is sort of the bare minimum requirements of the federal level, but they're designed to be an underpinning to your entire system, regardless of funding source and regardless of the type of programming. Next slide, please. So the CoC, like I said, is designed, is charged with designing a local system. So not just implementing the CoC funding, but a system that is comprehensive enough to serve both sheltered and unsheltered persons experiencing homelessness and provide all the necessary services to help them access housing and obtain their stability. It's designed to promote a community-wide planning and strategy so that all of your resources are being used effectively to address homelessness, and to coordinate amongst your homeless service system providers, as well as other mainstream resources that can respond to persons experiencing homelessness, and to improve your data collection and your performance measurement, which has become particularly more important in the last few years. Next slide. So this is just a visual of what a CoC looks like at sort of the most minimal level. So you have, when we say CoC, people often refer to that as a synonym with your governance body, which would be you all. But when we mean CoC, we actually mean your collective membership. All of the agencies, all of the people that are responding to homelessness, that all should come together to be setting up this structure. And then they elect a governing body to represent them, which is you. And then there are committees that often where most of the work happens of the CoC, right? These are a couple of examples, but there can be, I worked with some CoCs that have 20, 25 committees, right? That's probably a little much to be effective. But what those committees are can be really different depending on what your priorities are as a community, what type of funding you have coming in and available to you, what kind of populations have unique and special characteristics within your community. It can be a lot of different things. Okay, so that's our contextual framework for a CoC, and now we're going to move into the roles. So let's go ahead 2 slides. There are 7 defined roles within the HUD interim role. So there's the governing board, the collaborative applicant, the HMIS lead, the membership, committees, staff, and persons with lived experience is not defined in the interim rule, but that's really become a priority for HUD based on the recent NOFO applications for the CoC and something that really needs to be considered as an essential role within your CoC. So we're going to talk quickly about each of these individually. Next slide. So the governing board, which is the leadership of the continuum of care, which is made up of you all, right? And you've been, the board is established by the continuum of care to act on its behalf, right? It is not easy to make policy decisions and move work forward with, you know, sometimes hundreds and hundreds of people that may participate as members of a CoC. And so it's a smaller body that works on behalf of the CoC. But what on behalf of is not defined by HUD. That is something that you define within your governance charter. So that can look really different from community to community. The board has minimal responsibilities that we're going to go through as necessary by HUD, but you may have other responsibilities that are designated to you or authorized to you by the governance charter. So there's a lot of latitude for what a governing board can look like and how they can operate within the interim rule. And that's really so that HUD allows every community to have the flexibility to set up a board that works best for their community. And you get to define that. Next slide, please. What is at least partially defined is who should sit on your board, and really that it needs to be representative, right, of the relevant organizations and the projects that serve all of the populations within your population of persons experiencing homelessness in your community. So it's not defined who needs to be on it. It is defined that it needs to be representative of your unique community and persons experiencing homelessness within your community. HUD does require, as part of the CoC, that you have at least one individual who is currently or has previously experienced homelessness on your board. However, in the recent years, HUD has really pushed that in the NOFO process, adding more points for this process and defining that in order to get all of the points available to you in the CoC funding process, you need to be engaged with more than one individual who is a person with lived expertise of homelessness, that those individuals need to have experienced homelessness within the last 7 years, and that at least one of those individuals is or has recently experienced unsheltered homelessness. So those are really priorities that are coming through from HUD in the NOFO process to further define what it means to engage with persons with lived experience above and beyond the requirement that you have one person on your board. Your membership has to be selected using a process that's defined in writing in your charter, including your term limits. And that written process has to be reviewed and updated and approved by the entire CoC membership at least once every 5 years. And that you really want to make sure that all of your key partners and stakeholders have representation that is inclusive of your demographics within your community and the population of persons experiencing homelessness. Next slide, please. One of the other critical things that is defined is that you must have a code of conduct, a conflict of interest, and a recusal process for your board members. What is contained in that is not specifically defined. You'll see that a lot. You'll see that consistently from HUD, right? Because it may depend on what makes sense for your community, right? But your conflict of interest policy and the process for recusing people from discussions needs to be outlined in your governance charter. Best practices are that representatives of funded entities, so usually provider entities, but not always, who sit on the board should recuse themselves from funding decisions and the NOFO process, right? So that they're not making funding decisions about money that could potentially benefit their organization that they represent. Board members that are affiliated with your collaborative applicant or your HMIS lead or other entities to which you designate in your charter any responsibilities should recuse themselves from the evaluation of these entities, which is a role of yours as a board, that you're evaluating the entities that you've designated responsibilities towards. So you should develop and must develop a conflict of interest statement that outlines your specific expectations and provides the opportunity for any board members to declare any conflicts that they have with the conflicts of interest that you've defined within your charter.
And then I would just add, I mean, again, Dusty said this and the slides specifically calls out CoC funding decisions and NOPO, but because HUD can only talk about what's under its purview. But obviously best practice is you're defining conflict of interest more broadly for your community in that statement and thinking about all the range of conflicts that might exist. And so I know that's something many of you know that we've been working with the transition committee, looking through the charter and identifying areas where things may need to be tightened up a little bit. And this is an example of one thing your community may need a stronger or a tighter conflict of interest policy. Dusty, we'll go on to the next slide.
Great. Next slide, please. So collaborative applicant. Hopefully that's what you're seeing. So the collaborative applicant is the other sort of primary role that is defined by HUD in addition to the board. The collaborative applicant's responsibilities are to compile and submit the annual application to HUD for CoC program funds and to apply for planning funds on behalf of the continuum of care. So every continuum of care is eligible for a planning grant that supports various things that allows the CoC to meet their responsibilities, right? However, in many communities, in most communities, the collaborative applicant does things above and beyond those two required responsibilities. Those things need to be designated by the CoC in the governance charter if there are going to be additional responsibilities assigned to the collaborative applicant on behalf of the CoC. So one example might be that the collaborative applicant might be the host agency for staff that support CoC functions, so like running your meetings or staffing committees. But that's not the case in a lot of communities. It is the case in some communities. That's just an example of one additional thing that could be assigned to the collaborative applicant that needs to be outlined in your governance charter. Next slide, please. So it's important to understand that the collaborative applicant works on behalf of the CoC when applying to HUD for grant funding. So they are not the applicant. The CoC is the applicant. The collaborative applicant is the entity that is designated to respond. So they may be directly responsible for the development of the application. They may not. They may really just gather the information that's developed by somebody else and put it in the computer and hit submit. That all depends on how you define roles and responsibilities within your governance charter. But the CoC board selects the collaborative applicant to work on their behalf, right? So the collaborative applicant should be evaluated by the board to make sure that they're meeting their responsibilities. And the CoC board has the authority to change the collaborative applicant if they're not meeting the responsibilities or if there's some other reason. I work with a lot of communities that have to change collaborative applicants because of capacity, right? Whoever was the collaborative applicant just doesn't have the capacity to continue to serve in that role, so they have to find another entity to serve in that role. The CoC board has to approve the entire consolidated application before it's submitted by the collaborative applicant. Because remember, the collaborative applicant is submitting on your behalf, not instead of. So you have to approve the application because you retain all of the planning and prioritization responsibilities. Okay. The other thing that the collaborative applicant does is that they are the recipient from HUD for the planning grant, and they allocate that to the responsibilities and priorities that your charter designates that your planning grant is going to pay for. Right? In many communities, the planning grant pays for staff to operate the CoC. In some communities, it doesn't pay for staff at all, and it pays for things like training for partners and stipends for persons with lived experience. And there's a lot of things that your planning grant can pay for, but that passes through your collaborative applicant. Next slide. HMIS. So HMIS in the acronym world stands for Homeless Management and Information System, and it is the data system that all of the information about who is experiencing homelessness within your community and the services that they receive goes into. And you are responsible as a board for designating and evaluating an HMIS lead, whose job it is to carry out the responsibilities and the day-to-day operations of your HMIS system. So they are the ones that administer it. They work with the provider. They provide training to people who are entering data. They go and develop user agreements with all of the agencies that are inputting. All of the day-to-day operations are overseen by the HMIS lead role. Your role as the board is to designate who the HMIS lead is and evaluate whether or not they are meeting their responsibilities to your satisfaction. Next slide, please. Membership. Okay, so we said that the CoC is defined as representatives of relevant organizations within a geographic area. So that is who your membership is. Are those relevant organizations or staff within those relevant organizations. And the goal is that they are demonstrating by membership of the CoC that they are committed to ending and preventing homelessness within the strategy and priorities that the CoC defines, right? But it is their job as a collective whole to adopt and follow the written process to act on your behalf. It is their job to adopt and approve the charter and any revisions to the governance charter, right? And ideally, it is their role to help set the strategic direction for the continuum of care, right? Which is why it's important that you have all of these types of providers and partners and stakeholders involved as members of your continuum of care to increase that collective buy-in and to increase the cooperation and the interagency response to persons experiencing homelessness. Next slide, please. Nearly all CoCs have a fair number of working groups or committees that manage the activities of the CoC in a diverse and structured manner. So as the governing board, it would be impossible really for you in a large CoC like yours to execute all of the strategic work and the responsibilities of the CoC because you all have other jobs within your agency and organization. And you are, doing this in addition to, right? So establishing committees is important to being able to execute successfully all of your responsibilities. So you want to make sure that the roles and responsibilities of committees are clearly defined and that you have put protections in place in case there are any potential conflicts of interest. So here's a few examples of the types of committees that you can have, but that all is defined and developed by your community for what makes sense for you and then is defined in your charter. So there often is a governance committee that's sometimes called the board, that sometimes can be an advisory committee. Some communities have two governance type committees. There's often an HMIS group that is responsible for looking at data within your system. You could have a lived Experience Advisory Committee that is made up entirely of persons with lived expertise of homelessness. I would advise in general that it's better that all of these committees have persons with lived experience of homelessness instead of doing a standalone committee on the side, but lots of communities do that. You may have a coordinated entry policy committee that is designed to sort of help support the day-to-day operations of your coordinated entry. You likely have a project application rating and ranking committee that puts together your NOFO application prior to your looking and approving it. You may have a provider group, you may have a funders group, right, that are designed so that everybody is working under the same standards or funding the same types of projects to work collaboratively together. You can have quality improvement or performance evaluation committees. You can have as many or as few committees as you think are necessary to execute the responsibilities of your continuum, but more importantly, to make sure that the infrastructure is working in a way that you are all working in the same direction towards similar goals, regardless of funding source, regardless of project type, right? That there's consistency across your system and that people are working collaboratively together. If something's a permanent standing committee, you want to define that in your charter, but you also want your charter to reflect that you may be able to, you can stand up ad hoc or temporary committees if needed for any particular given project.
And
when
of
you
course,
think about who's,
sorry,
go ahead, Kristy.
No, I was just gonna add in, of course, everyone here, I'm sure, knows that we're in this process of transitioning from the committees that have been in existence to the new committees outlined in the charter that was approved earlier this year. And as we've been talking about the domain and the roles of those different committees, we've identified some important gaps in thinking about, you know, where are certain tasks and conversations and policy decisions going to happen. So I know those are conversations that will be coming at that, you know, that you've been having in these your leadership board meetings and that you'll continue to have. And it's, you know, it's important that as Dusty said, that you have a process outlined in your charter for, you know, how you stand up new committees and how you have both a continuity but flexibility, because ours is the homeless services landscape is one that changes really frequently. So having a framework so you all know sort of what are your standing committees, but then as Dusty said, what's the process if you need to establish a new committee or you need a time limited work group just to get done a specific task or deliverable. So those are some of the changes that we've been thinking through in the transition committee that will be coming up to you all in subsequent leadership board meetings. So I just wanted to call that out because I know this has been an ongoing conversation. And Dusty, sorry to interrupt you. Go back to you.
No, that was a great point, Kristy. Thank you. I was simply going to say, just like we think about representation on your board and representation in your membership, you also, as your seating committees, want to think about representation in that space as well. And you want to think about overlap, right? If you have the same people on all of your committees, right, that's probably not good representation. So you want to think about your system like holistically as you're seating your committees to make sure that you have representation from a lot of diverse perspectives across your continuum. Next slide. So CoC staff. CoC staff are not defined by HUD. And that's because that looks really different in different communities. Some CoCs have one person that actually works for them and it has a coordinator title and works for their collaborative applicant. Some communities have 7 or 8 people that work for their CoC with all different subsets of the responsibility, and they work for a nonprofit, right? It really depends on your community. And so while we don't define where the staff where they sit, what we do suggest is that there needs to be somebody whose responsibility it is to sort of wrangle all of these pieces and make sure that they're happening. So managing the CoC's calendar, both for membership meetings and board meetings and committee meetings, right? Making sure that all of that happens. Most of the time for COCs, almost always, those are public meetings, right? So there needs to be agendas and attendance records and minutes need to be posted someplace, right? So there's a lot of logistical support that needs to happen to make sure that these committees are all meeting their requirements and functional and taking care of what they need to do. There also needs to be somebody whose role it is to really stay aware of HUD and their changing priorities and requirements and to keep everybody informed. So the NOFO is one way that HUD indicates their priorities, but there's a lot of other things that happen that it's helpful to have somebody who can kind of keep that abreast. And like in our role as technical assistance providers, we are often the ones sort of connecting with the staff at the CoC to say like, hey, this is a new thing on the horizon, or this is new guidance from HUD that's just come out, and making sure that they are able to keep up with that information without having to go seek it out themselves. But your continuum may also have staff that work specifically for the collaborative applicant and take on that role of the piece of the any of the responsibilities that you've designated in your charter to the collaborative applicant. The HMIS lead usually has staff that work on behalf of the continuum in that role. You may have coordinated entry staff, right, that work on behalf of the continuum, and all of those staff may work for different agencies, but they're still working on behalf of the continuum and working to meet the responsibilities that you are charged with making sure happen at the CoC level.
And then I just want to reiterate, Dusty, your point that the CoC staff, the staffing of the board and the committees, as Dusty said, is not something that's called out specifically in the HUD rule, and because HUD wants communities to have flexibility here. So a lot of communities, these roles are designated to the collaborative applicant. If a community wants to designate them to a different entity, that all has to be outlined in the charter. So really designating and being very clear about the boundaries of the roles and who's taking on those responsibilities, and then how the board will evaluate the entities in those roles. I just, again, wanted to call that out, as I know that's been a frequent topic of conversation in this community recently.
Great, thank you, Kristy. Next slide, please. So I mentioned most of this already about engagement with persons with lived experience of homelessness, and I am going to be in your community in November, and we're going to do a multiple-hour training on effective engagement with persons with lived experience of homelessness, because it is clear that that's a it's clear that that's a priority of HUD, but really, regardless of whether or not it's the priority of HUD, what we know it to be is a best practice to ensure that your system is effectively serving persons experiencing homelessness. And so I'm gonna be on site with a couple other TA providers in November to do more extensive training for you on this. So we'll talk more about that in a couple of months. Next slide, please. So as we talked, like all of these roles have to work together, right? And how they work together looks different in different communities. So the authority can be delegated to the board, a committee, a work group, the collaborative applicant, the HMIS lead, right? Responsibilities can be designated to a lot of different individuals and entities. You as a group, as a collective CoC, including your membership, need to make a decision, right, about what makes sense for how those responsibilities are designated in your committee. And then that is all defined in your charter, right? And then your charter needs to be evaluated regularly, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But that way, everybody knows who is meeting which parts of these responsibilities that you have, right? The charter may not be sufficient, so you also may want to execute MOUs between yourself as a board on behalf of the CoC and maybe your collaborative applicant, maybe your HMIS lead, right? MOUs could further define relationships between partners that you may not want to spell out in your charter because it might be a little more detailed than you want to get in your charter. Like, for example, how things are going to get paid for and things like that. Next slide. So we wanted to pause here to see if you had any questions, but also to just open it up for a minute about if you feel like there's role clarity throughout your system about how these responsibilities, how these roles are defined and who is sort of sitting in that space. And I have been totally kicked out of the Zoom, so I can't even see your frozen faces anymore. So Kristy, if you could sort of facilitate this conversation so that you can see people if they want to jump in or raise their hand or.
Yes, and folks can put information or questions in the chat as well. I don't see any hands. Anyone have any questions or observations they want to share? Kimberly, go ahead.
Yes, I was wondering if there's maybe some videos training on COCs just to help, you know, some of us that are newer understand it better. It's hard to understand exactly what that is, which organizations it encompasses, and what everyone home's role is in that. And I was just wondering if there's some like training available online somewhere.
There is some, but it's not going to be, it'll be even more generic than what we've talked about here because of the elements that HUD isn't defining, right? They say you have to have, for example, a collaborative applicant, and that it has to do at the bare minimum these two things. But it could look completely different in your community. So it's really, I think, critical that as you are onboarding new board members and committee members, right, that there are things put together, and this is something that like we can help you with from the TA side, that really explain what all that looks like in your community. So like I had the example, right, of the visual graphic of what a COC could look like developing one of those for your COC so that you can sit down and understand each of the partners within your community and kind of what they're responsible for doing as it's outlined for your community. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. And there's probably more than I realize. That's on me joining the board and then going to a new employer and having to train for crisis line 70 hours. It's just been a distraction. So I really want to catch up and I want to know the best way to catch up. But I could probably just talk to Katie and Dorcas later on. So thank you.
And then I think Darlene has her hand up as well.
Thank you. Dusty, you said you were going to be doing some training. Could you say again what that training is about? I had a brain happened.
We're still in the initial planning phases, but what's been requested is 2 days of training, 2 like 3-hour blocks. One will be on racial equity, and the other one will be on authentic engagement with persons with lived experience of homelessness.
That's what I thought.
And those will be in November.
Yeah, that's what I thought I heard. And I just want to say that I think that those are very important, obviously, because of the work I do. I think it's very important that we all are on the same page about equity and what it is and what it isn't. Because there's not a lot of equity going on in homelessness services right now. We have such huge disparities that we're really fighting an uphill battle. But if we don't understand what we're up against and how to approach it systematically, we're probably not going to be able to fix it either. So that's point 1. And point 2 is this working with people with lived experience and working across races, since people with lived experience are disproportionately Black, is connected to equity and bias and assumptions and all kinds of things that come into the room when we attempt to involve people. And I have watched so many occasions where people come willingly and give us their time that they don't really have, but they're not really included. They're not in the club. They don't have the secret handshake. And to Kimberly's questions that she was just asking, they need to get better access and have things more accessible than people who know what all those acronyms mean. And so I feel that piece. I don't know what the acronyms mean. And right there, you're not speaking the same language. And then it goes from there. It gets worse from there. What happens to people who have been marginalized when we bring them to the table. And it's just a really hard thing for me to watch. And I wouldn't want us to replicate that. The presence of people with lived expertise is critical to getting the work right, but they shouldn't have to suffer in the process. So
Absolutely.
Thank you, Dusty.
Absolutely. You're welcome. I'm really looking forward to being in the space with you. We won't have technical problems because I'll actually be there in person to get to do that.
Dusty, I'm not seeing any other questions right now. So maybe in the interest of time, we go back to the slides.
Okay, let's go ahead 2 slides as we move into responsibilities, right? So what are the responsibilities of the continuum of care as requirements? They fall into 4 buckets. Operation of the continuum, system planning, data management, and CoC funding application. The only one of these that is specific to only CoC funding is the CoC funding application. All of the rest of these operations should be thought of as system coordination and things that apply to your entire system, not just the continuum funding application. Okay, so we're going to talk quickly about operations, right? I designed these slides so that you would have them as a resource. For purposes of time, we're not going to be able to talk through every single element that is included in these slides, but I wanted you to have them as a resource to refer back to if you have questions or if you need any additional board training or discussion. So if you see me kind of skip over some elements, that's intentional. So system operations, next slide. The CoC provides, as I said, the framework for the development of a fully functional, efficient homeless response system, ideally, right? It is designed to ensure that homelessness is rare, brief, and one time, right? But what you want to make sure that is happening is that planning and policy at the CoC level should be developed for your entire system, regardless of funding source, so that all of your partners, whether they are funded by the CoC application or not, are working towards a common goal in an organized and collaborative fashion. So the operation of the system is of the entire system, not just of like your funded partners that are funded through the NOFO application, not just of any way you can slice and dice your system. It's designed to function as an entire continuum. That's why it's called continuum of care, right? So that like everything falls under it. Next slide. You are required to hold at least semi-annual membership meetings where your entire CoC membership is invited, right? You have to issue a public invitation for new members to your CoC in your entire area at least once annually, right? When I say you, that comes from the board, right? But who issues that can be different, right? Depending on, who is sort of staffing the board, who is leading that. It may come from your collaborative applicant. It may come from your board chair. Like it can look a lot of different ways. It's just required to happen, right? And we already talked a lot about relevant organization. So next slide. And we've talked a lot about your governance charter, right? This is work that you are currently working on, right? You want to think of your governance charter as your blueprint, right? Like how are we going to function? How are we going to build this framework and this infrastructure so that we have a functional system? So you want to detail the functions of all of those roles that we just talked about and what their responsibilities are so that everything is laid out around what are the policies and procedures, who's going to do those things, what is the code of conduct for participants of your board or your committees, what is your conflict of interest policy look like, what is your recusal process when there is a conflict of interest. All of that needs to be laid out in your governance charter. You as a board are required to review your governance charter annually, and you need to have it adopted by your entire membership every 5 years. So most communities review it regularly, and then save large substantial changes if they're not urgent to be done in advance of the next time that the charter needs to be adopted. Kristy, do you have anything you want to add there?
No, not right now. Thanks, Dusty.
Okay, next slide. Coordinated entry. We could do an entire 90-minute discussion of coordinated entry. So this is going to be 30 seconds of what could be 90 minutes. Coordinated entry is a requirement of a continuum of care. So you have to establish and operate a coordinated entry system that is designed to assess individuals and their needs across your geographic area, that is easily accessible, right? And it is intentionally designed to ensure more equitable access and prioritization of individuals who are the most vulnerable to receive the limited services that you have, because there's not a single community in the country that has all of the homelessness services that they need in order to respond to their system. If there was, we would not need coordinated entry to look nearly the way that it does. Next slide. The elements of coordinated entry are access, assessment, prioritization, and referral, right? Those steps look very different in different communities, so I'm not going to speak to what your coordinated entry looks like, but you need to understand as a board that you are required for the planning and implementation of coordinated entry, which almost always happens through a committee, but ultimately it's something that you're required to have as part of your continuum. Next slide. You are also required to have written standards for CoC assistance. And while this is CoC specific, the regulation does define that you must have to work with your ESG recipients, which you have multiple jurisdictions in your community that receive ESG. The county receives ESG, the city of Oakland receives ESG, the city of Berkeley receives ESG. I think that might be it. But you're required to develop standards in cooperation with them about who is eligible for assistance and what types of assistance you're going to have available, what types of programs you're going to have available, how much assistance, for example, for rapid rehousing or prevention or other types of programs you're going to make available in your community. So while these are CoC standards for your NOFO and for ESG recipients, it makes the most sense if these standards are applied across your board, across your system, right? As a provider, it's really challenging to be like, I have to do this, and I have this requirement for this funding source, and I have to do this, and I have this requirement and this eligibility for this funding source. As a CoC, you can take on the responsibility to develop those for your continuum, regardless of your funding source, which will make it easier to implement programs and will make it much easier for persons experiencing homelessness to move through your system if there are not all of these behind the scenes eligibility requirements and standards that they don't understand why they can and can't receive assistance. Next slide. System performance expectations and monitoring, like it's your job to monitor that your program is working functionally. There's programmatic monitoring, which most often falls to the collaborative applicant, right, to make sure that a program is meeting its responsibilities, or whoever has been designated the grants management entity in your continuum. But as a continuum board, right, you want to assure that there's systematic monitoring that's happening too. As a system, how are we functioning to move people through our system and exit homelessness, right? You can base your monitoring for programs on what HUD does, because HUD monitors both recipients and subrecipients, right? So recipients are who directly gets the money for the continuum. Subrecipients are who that money is passed through to execute the services. So they have regulations that define what monitoring can look like, and that's a great way to start for your monitoring. But that's programmatic monitoring. Your systematic monitoring really needs to be about how programs are working together to create a functional system. Next slide. The next two slides are record keeping. There are standards for record keeping about what the continuum is responsible to keep, both at a continuum level and at a program level. And I'm not going to go into those. I just wanted you to have them here. Okay, we're going to go two slides ahead to system planning. In the interest of time, I'm going to jump. Can we go all the way to slide 42? Because I promised Katie that we would talk about the funding application this time. And if we need to add more time at another date, we can do that. But I want to make sure that we talk about that. So let's jump to slide 42. Actually, we'll go to 43. So one of your primary responsibilities, and this, as I said, is the only responsibility that is specific to a single funding source and not to your system as a whole, is to the CoC funding application. So every year, HUD makes the CoC program funds available through a Notice of Funding Opportunity. That's what NOFO stands for. Used to be Notice of Funding Availability, so you may hear NOFA sometimes. That's what NOFO and NOFA stand for. And it is the funding that you receive as a continuum for the eligible housing and homeless service projects, right? And the funding that you get as your CoC planning grant. Your planning grant can be used to help you execute all of these other responsibilities that we've been talking about. So your collaborative applicant, like I said, submits your CoC consolidated application as part of the competition on behalf of you. Next slide. So the CoC as a whole needs to set the funding priorities. So what are the priorities that you have for your funding within your community? Generally, you want to do that within the context of understanding what HUD's priorities are for the funding, because the more your priorities align with their priorities, the more likely you are to have a successful application and get the majority of your project funded. However, you have a lot of wiggle room within those things about, you know, what percentage of the money do you want to put into rapid rehousing versus PFH, for example. Those types of decisions all should flow from your funding priorities, right? You have to develop and facilitate a collaborative process to develop the application, including the rating and ranking process. So how projects are rated and they're ranked, that is developed by you as a continuum. HUD does supply a rating and ranking tool that is generic that you can use to base that on. Some communities use that, some make up completely their own tool. But you have to have a process that is applied and consistent for all of your applications. You then approve the annual submission of the application. So you approve the rating and ranking, you determine what tiers are funding going to go into. There's 2 tiers in the NOFO process, tier 1 and tier 2. Tier 1 almost always gets completely funded by HUD because it is based on the current amount that you receive now. And so you decide which projects you're going to put into that tier 1. Tier 2, there's a potential that projects don't receive funding if they're in tier 2. There's also bonus funding that's available every time that can be for new projects that have never been funded before, or it can be for specific populations. So the last few NOFOs, there's been a domestic violence bonus fund that has been projects specifically to serve domestic violence survivors. So you make decisions about which projects go into which tier and which projects are bonus applications. And then you approve that, and then the collaborative applicant submits all of the applications in their ranked order and in their tiers on your behalf. Usually the process of putting the applications into the tiers and other pieces are conducted by a committee. Then brings the recommendation to the board, and then you can either make changes to that recommendation or approve it. Next slide. Okay, so that's what I just said. So the project applications get submitted from the providers, right? And then need to all be reviewed and accepted and ranked, and then you approve or reject that recommendation of the accepted projects and the rank and the order that they're in and what tier they're in. You have to use an objective performance-based scoring criteria, right? A certain percentage of your points as a CoC that you receive is based on how effective your rating and ranking process is, and what percentage of your scoring was based on the performance of the individual program. So using the system performance measures that are defined by HUD, you need to monitor all of the programs to where they're meeting the performance, and use that in your rating and ranking process. Right? You want to use your rating and ranking process to determine the extent to which each project addresses HUD's policy priorities that they lay out in the NOFO, right? They're asking for specific things. You have to determine which applications are most likely to meet those needs. You can choose to reallocate funds to new projects if that will improve your outcomes and reduce homelessness within your community. So if you look at that performance and you have a project that's been funded for a while and they're really not effectively moving people out of homelessness, you may want to make a decision to reallocate the money that they're receiving to a project that you think would be more effective, either by expanding a project that exists already that is doing a great job and could just use more money, or by developing a new project that you think is more in line with HUD's priorities, and that you think would be more effective to reduce homelessness. So this is really not a process where you just rubber stamp the same programs to be funded year over year over year. You need to be looking and evaluating whether or not the programs that you're funding and the projects that you're funding are doing what is necessary to respond to homelessness, and make changes if that's not the case. And then you have to publicly post the process that you're going to use in your rating and ranking process to create your application. That is a requirement to make sure that it is an open and transparent process. I know you guys are about to go into that. So are there questions? Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Kristy.
No, that's exactly what I was going to do. I was going to say, and before we go on to other topics, I wonder if we just want to pause here and see if folks have questions. It's a lot of information. I'm trying to look at hands here. Hold on. I think I'm seeing any questions. Oh, looks like I have one. Darlene?
Yes, I'm curious about what the position is if we know that our coordinated entry process as it currently exists is not equitably serving Black people in, say, Oakland who are homeless. Because of the way the model is designed, it doesn't count race as a risk factor. And so it's really hard for Black folks to get to services. I mean, it's like they have to take up drugs or something, or alcoholism. Not what we want to encourage. I'm just wondering what's anticipated about that look at coordinating. I know we have to have coordinated entry, but what about equity and coordinated entry?
I mean, that's really like nationwide. That's been the number1 conversation for sure. When HUD first rolled out coordinated entry, it's another one of these things where they say, this is what you need to do, but we're not going to tell you how to do it. So one of the things that it said was you need to have an assessment and prioritization process. One of those 4 things that I mentioned, right, of what a requirement is. But we're not going to tell you what that assessment or prioritization process needs to look like. You need to define that as a community. When it was brand new and everybody was trying to quickly stand up a system to meet this need, the easiest thing for communities to do was to take a plug and play assessment and use it. And that's what 95% probably of communities across the country did. And most communities use the VI SPDAT. And what we now know after several years of implementing that is that there are fundamental biases within the assessment tool. There are lots of places that bias comes into coordinated entry in addition to the assessment. Who's doing the assessment, who's doing the prioritization, lots and lots of things. But we know that the tool itself also has some issues, right? And you are not using that tool any longer, which is good. You were one of the first communities to move away from that. But what it resulted in was sort of a nationwide inequitable coordinated entry process as a result of sort of the universal adoption of this tool. And so HUD is really trying to figure out, honestly, and I sit on HUD's coordinated entry product development team, and they're trying to figure out how to help communities move away from using that tool and develop more equitable processes with coordinated entry without simultaneously saying this is what it has to look like, right? So like trying to balance that, we're not going to define it for you. We want you to define it as a community, but not every community is in the same place with being able to develop an equitable process. So I wish I had a good answer. It's probably the biggest conversation happening nationwide right now is what to do about the inequities within coordinated entry.
And then Dusty, I would just also say, I mean, although the question of, what assessment tools and protocols to use and, what prioritization criteria community has established, those are really complicated questions, but the broader sort of point I want to make around today's training is this is exactly why, HUD has these requirements around establishing committees and using your data, because again, these are really complicated issues and they change, right? Like one policy decision has ripple effects. And so if you're not constantly looking at your data and you don't have bodies, meaning committees or work groups that are assigned and responsible to be looking at these issues, it's hard to keep up with those changes. So that's sort of why we are talking about having this infrastructure for your system. Many communities are, regularly looking at their data, their equity data, who's getting matched to housing, where are bottlenecks in the process, who's struggling finding units, and thinking about what are the policy changes and shifts that have to be made. And they're not necessarily easy answers, but the point is, constantly asking those questions, using your data to guide you, and so again, that's just part of the process, I think, of good and effective system approaches.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that really was a disservice is that a lot of communities said, okay, we've established coordinated entry, and then just sort of let it ride. And so it took a long time before inequities were viewed and really brought to the surface. Coordinated entry and all of this should be like an ever-changing thing. Like as soon as something doesn't look right, like we got to figure out how to change the policy so that we can address that. And so, really it needs to be a much more nimble process that is being constantly evaluated, as opposed to something you stand up and then it runs forever in that same way. But it takes a lot of capacity, right, for people to do that. You're a CoC that has a lot of capacity as far as like, good people to look at your data and do analysis. You have a lot of technical assistance. A lot of communities don't have anything like that. And so, trying to figure out how to be more equitable in that space is, I consider it to be the number one problem that HUD is trying to problem solve right now.
And then Vivian, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah. Thank you, Dusty. Maybe we can have an offline conversation about it, because I think we are making progress, but I keep losing track.
I'd love to.
Yeah, thanks.
Sorry, go ahead, Vivian.
No, it's, and I just wanted to ask a question. It's, it's my understanding, because we really wanted to use actually race in our tool, but it's my understanding that we have been instructed that we can't from a legal perspective, because we know the correlation, the overrepresentation in our homeless community, but we've looked at that and wanted to, and have been told we can't from a legal perspective. It's my understanding, the folks who create this tool, and also my understanding that we actually in this community have never used the VI SPDAT. We actually made a homegrown tool, through data and testing and analysis with a race lens from the get-go. We didn't have to move away from it because we never used it. But unless my memory doesn't serve me. But just as an aside.
Yeah, and I could be wrong about that because I know you had something else before I even came into Oakland. But in regards to your first part, you're right. HUD has been very clear that you cannot use race as a prioritization factor because of fair housing. And so, there are lots of efforts to figure out what a proxy is for that, because I think, everybody who understands equity understands that race is in fact a vulnerability factor in nearly every community in the country, right? Because of systemic and institutional racism. And so it is in fact a vulnerability. And there are lots of communities that would like to be able to use it as a prioritization factor, but it's not allowed. And so there's a lot of communities trying to figure out what can they use as a proxy to make sure that persons who are overrepresented in homelessness receive prioritization without using race.
Hi, this is Nick. Sorry for my terrible type in there. What I learned last year is what we can look at though is percentages of representation or overrepresentation in homelessness as compared to the general population. And that could apply to race as well as other, I guess, categories or criteria. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. But I think this conversation is a great example of the type of conversations that need to be happening in your continuum at both the continuum and the board level, right? Of let's look at our data and figure out where these inequities are and what is the way that we can fix that. And so really looking at how do you plan effectively to implement your system. And so I think, the last couple of minutes of conversation is exactly the types of conversations that you want to be having, and that you want to be having, in multiple spaces within your continuum.
And again, I know some of the conversations we've been having around the charter and the committee roles and how decisions are made. Sometimes that seems very dry and it doesn't feel like the real work of the continuum, as I've heard some people say, we have to get onto the real work. But that supports the ability to have these really complex conversations and understand, who's working on issues, how decisions are made, how recommendations are brought up to the leadership board, and ultimately how things keep moving forward in an efficient way. So just wanted to note that. Dusty, so I'm just keeping an eye on time. We have 5 minutes left. Yep. I don't know if anyone has any specific NOFO questions or if there were other pieces of the deck you wanted to go back to. I do see one more hand. Rachel, do you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to give a comment about the NOFO process. So shifting gears a little bit, but I just also want to take a moment to say thank you so much for the comments that were just made, and I look forward to continuing those conversations. And with regards to the NOFO, I just wanted to give some clarity for our CoC, kind of who holds what responsibilities in that process that Dusty was just describing. So In our COC, it's now the leadership board who votes on the strategic direction at the beginning of the process. So often shortly after the NOFO is released, giving those guiding principles, which are then handed off to a NOFO committee, which is the group that's non-conflicted, doesn't include any applicants. And that's the group that here approves the scoring criteria, which then turns into an application. They're also the group that reviews the applications and does the rating and ranking. Then if there is an appeal, there is a separate appeal panel, and that's also a group of 3 unconflicted folks. And then the stage that we're getting to coming up next week is that the whole package, including the rating and ranking and the consolidated application, comes back to leadership board just a couple of days before it's submitted. And the leadership board has an opportunity to discuss, and then anyone who's not conflicted votes to approve that. And it's kind of the last step in this process. So I just wanted to let folks know where we're at in that process this year. Then of course it will begin again next year, where the leadership board will have a big say in the strategic direction.
Rachel, thank you for that. That's helpful clarification on the local process. Dusty, just wanted, I know you can't see the chat. So Susan, do you want to share your question with Dusty?
Hey, Susan.
Hey, Dusty. Either of you could respond. I don't know exactly who is HUD TA and not, so I apologize. So we are asked, this is what I hear you saying. We're asked as a locality to understand that HUD is in the process of looking at the paradoxes, if you will, or maybe there's a better word, about equity, achieving that inside of race and so many other things, right? And so you're saying, we got it, we see it, but right now, legally, there's nothing we can have you do about it inside of this NOFO process or our programs for the moment, but we are engaged in it. But right now, the net of that is we are still bound to not use or program or do anything substantive other than through word of mouth that it's a priority. And HUD is saying, just give us some time, but if you come up with something, let us know and we'll take a look at it. But for right now, apply the same way, understanding the legality.
No, that, yeah, but I'm happy you asked because I want to clarify that. So the only thing that HUD has said is that you cannot use race, right? That you cannot use race as part of your prioritization in your coordinated entry system. You can and are encouraged to look at inequities within your system in multiple ways. So you're encouraged to have equity as part of your NOFO process. Like if you're encouraged to say like, look, we know that this program, when we disaggregate their data by race as far as outcomes, they're not serving Black and brown individuals effectively. We might want to make a change to that. You absolutely can do that. You absolutely can do that. You can absolutely, within your coordinated entry system, look at inequities and try to figure out, with the exception of adamantly, like explicitly saying you want to prioritize by race, to figure out how it is that you can make policy and system changes to address the inequities within your system. HUD wants you to do that and encourages you to do that. The piece that they're working on is like, how is it that they provide guidance nationwide? And I think this is the hard part, right? Like communities are really different spaces. So when they're providing guidance to your community, right, that has, a position like Darlene's, right, that's embedded in with your city government that specifically works on equity and has a lot of, great equity champions like yourself, Susan, and other people in your community, many of which sit on your board here, prioritizing equity, right? They also have to have nationwide guidance for like middle podunk, you know, red state in the country that doesn't even acknowledge yet that they have equity issues because in their mind, everybody in their community experiencing homelessness is white. You know, so what they're trying to figure out is how is it that they provide guidance on addressing equity and resolving inequities within coordinated entry that works for everybody. And that's the challenge. But there is nothing saying like you guys cannot dig in and start working on inequities within your system and doing whatever it is that you think that you need to do to resolve those, as long as they're within your legal scope of what you're allowed to do.
Dusty, and I just want to keeping an eye on time. It's 2:30. Katie, I know everyone has the slides, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Do you, how do you want to wrap up this afternoon?
I think we need
the slides that we skipped are pretty self-explanatory. I looked through them, like they're in the scheme of the deck, they're the most easy to read and understand, but I'd be happy to make myself available for questions at another meeting if people want to follow up more or whatever works, Katie.
Yeah, I think we can wrap. There's a number of folks that couldn't join us today. Either way, we'll have the video and the slides for everyone. If there are ongoing questions before other upcoming trainings in person coming up, we can perhaps talk about bringing in some topics there. Or if there's other clarifying topics that we want to dig in together more in upcoming trainings beyond, because there's other virtual trainings that we're planning for, we can make sure to prioritize those topics. So once folks have a chance to review the slides in the video, we'll have a better sense, I think, if there's any outstanding questions around this specific kind of topic area.
Perfect.
I know it's a lot to cover and a lot to digest for everyone, so we're mindful of that and appreciate it takes some time.
It is. And I apologize for the delays that my technical issues caused and that I was not able to join you all in the Zoom meeting today. Talking to myself and my calendar is really not my preferred way of engaging with anything. So I apologize for the delay and the time that took too.
No worries. Thank you everybody for being here today. We'll make sure to get all the materials out to our large group. I know we have lots of meetings together coming up with the NOFO and other key issues. So we look forward to connecting you all at our next leadership board meeting, which is Thursday at 2 p.m. So we will see you all then. Thank you so much.